All right. Hello, guys, and hope you are doing well. And I am so glad that you are interested in joining in the cannabis industry, learning what it takes to be an accountant in the cannabis industry, right? And so I'm going to share my screen and we are going to spend the next 30 minutes together. And you are going to get 9 really insightful tips that are going to help you as an accountant or an accountant thinking about entering into the cannabis industry with some facts, with some strategy, and with some homework to get you up and started, feeling comfortable about operating in this space, and really navigating this unknown. All right, so let me share my screen with you all. So as you can see, as an accountant, when you're just getting in the industry, there are certain things that aren't necessarily like traditional industries, right? And over the course of this webinar, I'm going to explain what I've been able to gather since 2015 working in this space and some really insightful areas that you can start focusing on to help you make that transition or decide to make that transition if you so do, right? So my name is Simone Simaluka Radzins. I am a CPA. I have been a CPA since 2009 and spent a career ex-audit, PwC, internal audit for Fortune 500 companies, as well as international consulting before making that jump into cannabis, into entrepreneurship and becoming my own, freelance consultant and building something after in 2015. So when I entered versus today, there was not as much information. And so I had to really take it upon myself to do a lot of investigating, a lot of research, a lot of interviews. And, the fact is 2015 compared to where we are today, we're at more than 50% of the states have legalized cannabis in some form, right? In 2015, that was a fraction of the amount. And so as we see with more states legalizing, with more capital getting injected into the market, and with more professionals serving the market, there definitely is more information available out there. Still, not as much as you would think for accountants. I, in the cannabis industry, have written a book on IRC 280E, this punitive tax code that exists that we'll talk about later on in the webinar. I have helped clients apply for really coveted, hard to get cannabis licenses. So going through everything from the initial strategy to capital raising to actually working with the regulators and getting that all the way up and going. And then I have done, you'll notice cannabis is a capital intensive industry if you are operating in the supply chain. And so I've helped clients raise capital, do those pro forma projections and make sure that they were, have a sound financial strategy for themselves and for their business. And of course, one of the most, favorite things, honestly, for me is just to work with business owners and solve day-to-day problems, right? And so accounting, as we know, is a fundamental precept of business. So with the right data, with the right information, we can make information and decisions and that are very impactful for those businesses. So that's how I spend my time in cannabis. I've got a podcast. If you haven't checked it out, please do. It's Cannabis Business Minds. I've spoken internationally on cannabis regulation, on cannabis tax, and operating in the United States cannabis industry. And as I mentioned, I'm a published author. So thank you again for joining me in this. And, what I want you to realize what you are going to learn today, right? So what you can expect to learn. I'm going to give you an actionable plan to getting started in the cannabis industry. A lot has changed since when I first entered, but still it is very daunting. It is very confusing getting up to speed, getting information and starting in a new industry, let alone an industry that has, that's a very brand new industry, right? And so you're going to understand knowledge is power. And I'm going to give you some very important tips that can help you build your knowledge, get some more information to help you with that journey. I'm going to share some best practices that will make that transition for you. If you are coming from corporate or if you are coming from, traditional private industry and getting into the cannabis industry, I did that. So I'm going to give you some practical insight to help you make that transition. We'll talk about some of the risks that you need to consider when working in the cannabis space and making that transition, and then we're going to talk about finally steps to actually making action and getting started. So, first and foremost, I want to say thank you. I think I already did, but one other thank you. And the reason is that you are joining a revolution. The cannabis revolution has begun, but we're at the very beginning. When in your history as an accountant will you have ever been able to see that something being prohibited and then all of a sudden getting really big and part of society and changing lives and helping people's health and really impacting the economy and only for the better? The cannabis industry. The cannabis industry is a nascent, a very young industry. However, it is a once in a lifetime opportunity to shape the rules, to shape legislation, to make an impact for businesses, and to really make your mark as an individual, as a professional, and yes, as an accountant. Where we are today, as I mentioned, more than 50% of the states have legalized cannabis in some form. But that is in some form, because when you peel back the layers, there's not that many states that have adopted the adult use of cannabis, right? Some states have adopted medical use of cannabis, but you'll notice that not everybody has access to it. So again, what you're going to learn about regulation and regulators is that things take time. And so it's very, very exciting to be part of this revolution, right? Because you're more than just an accountant. You're not doing an accounting for an e-commerce company. Perhaps maybe you will be working with a CBD company that has e-commerce, but the cannabis industry and the businesses that are part of this cannabis industry are so exciting to be part of. And the product cannabis, right? And the people, the customers of cannabis, patients or consumers, are so different, are so exciting. And that is one of the joys of also being part of this industry. So thank you for wanting to be involved and wanting to find more information about this lovely, growing, and you'll often hear regulated industry. So let's get into the details, right? So I wanted to talk to you about 9 things that every accountant needs to know. The first one, first and foremost, you've got to understand the legalities of doing business, right? The cannabis industry is an interesting industry, right? Federally, it is still illegal, right? Federally, it's still illegal. Can you imagine? 50% of the states have legalized it. Federally, it is still illegal. So what's that mean? It means that there are a lot of laws and rules that a business cannot do, right? They would be breaking these laws, they'd be breaking these rules, like interstate commerce, right? Because it's federally illegal. A cannabis business cannot go move their product from Oregon to California because it's federally illegal. You'll notice that there's also a lot of other issues that, prohibit companies from doing just normal business activities. As I mentioned, I wrote a book on 280E, and we'll talk about that in a few slides, but the big thing about legality, federal illegality, means that there's some tax consequences for cannabis businesses, right? And so it's really important for you to understand from a federal level that it's federally illegal, but the impact that it can make on a business, right? The business owners, lack of protections, for example, and what it can make an impact on their financial circumstances, right? So it's a very important thing to understand what is federally illegal, like what the ramifications are of federally illegality, what additional controls need to be in place because it's still federally illegal, right? And then on the state side, more than 50% of states have legalized cannabis. Well, Cannabis is a state's issue. So each state has a separate load of rules and regulations and laws. And it's important, again, to know and understand those. Because when you think you understand what's happening in New York, well, there's going to be a whole set of different rules, regulations, and laws that might be happening in Illinois or California or Arizona. So it's really important for you as the accountant here to, you're not giving any legal advice here, but just to familiarize yourself with the impact that it can make for you. But more importantly, because the impact is relatively low, the impact that it can make for the businesses that you will be supporting. Right? It's not that it's so easy, you just put up a website and you can sell. There's a lot of nuances, a lot of rules, a lot of regulation that goes into all of this, right? So that is number one. One other point to number one, cannabis and CBD or hemp, let's say, right? In 2018, hemp, which we most commonly refer to as CBD, and there's so many nuances down that path, became federally legal in the United States, right? Federally legal. So not as many issues as cannabis, right? And so there's a whole nother myriad of a layer if you are working with a CBD company that is working with industrial hemp that was legalized in 2018, or if you're working with a cannabis company, or if you're working with a hybrid between CBD and cannabis. So as you can see, it's really important to kind of dive in and get into the detail. And the big point here, just to emphasize, is that why is it important to understand rules, regulation, and law? Well, it allows us to understand what can and cannot be done, right? And so, I would think about an example in the state of South Carolina. A lawyer, for example, cannot advertise that they are better than a competitor. It is a violation of the law. Something so small, something so seemingly innocent that somebody might think would be totally okay is actually against the law. So it's important for us to understand what can make or break a business, because a violation of a law, what happens there? Business owners are in trouble, right? Fines, penalties, bad loss of reputation, and a loss of a license, perhaps. So it's really important for you, as you are going to be working in the financials, to have the wherewithal to understand the foundation, the legal foundation. No degree in law necessary, right? But a legal foundation of what can and cannot be done. I'll talk to you about how to do that in the next few slides. Number two, research and expertise, right? So you are entering into an industry where the rules have been written, but the rules will change, right? The rules will be written, but the rules will change. So what do I mean by that? 2015, when I entered, not a lot of rules, not a lot of regulation. 2018, more states started legalizing, more rules, more regulation. But rules and regulation change all of the time. Sad fact, very true. That's why research is so important, just to feel comfortable with and to realize that that's going to be part of your arsenal. Not that, again, you have to know everything, but you have to know where to go to access the information. Einstein said, what's the importance of memorizing everything when I can access a library? I want you to think about it that way. You've got so many tools available to access information that you don't have to memorize it all, but it's important to know and where to go, what type of research to have in your arsenal, right? And so when I say research and when I say gaining expertise, there are a few things that I really want you to be focused on: cannabis laws and cannabis regulation, right? So kind of piggybacks from our first point, but those two are very important because those are going to define what the business can and cannot do. You're going to notice there's a lot of accounting in there, right? It's going to give you a lot of information there. And so you want to be able to know where to reference, how to find things, what websites to go to, what regulators to work with, right? Research is super important. Gaining expertise is based off of a few things, right? It's skill, it's knowledge, it's training. right? You're entering into a new industry. So technically, there are going to be technical differences than other industries that you've worked with, right? Healthcare is not going to match the cannabis industry. Agriculture is not going to match the cannabis industry. Retail is not going to match the cannabis industry. The cannabis industry is fascinating because it hybrids a lot of different industries, right? Where they are in the supply chain. But it's important to realize that you're going to have technical things that you want to learn and gain expertise on, the tax code, compliance, right? How to actually navigate some of this stuff. But you're also going to have a difference in how things are and how people work in this industry. So it's important to also, upskill in professional development, both on the technical level of gaining and honing expertise in accounting, but also on a professional level, leadership, building your practice, communication. All of these things are going to get you way far ahead as you build your practice or as you develop your career further and further. So it's really important that you focus on this number 2 point, research and gain expertise. Now, let's get into some of the technicalities here, right? So embrace cash, right? So we are, as an economy, as a world, quickly transitioning out of an all cash basis, right? So look at your wallet. How much cash do you have? A few coins? Do you have a 20, right? Think about where blockchain and Bitcoin, right? We are trending as a society into a cashless business, right? And there's a lot of reasons why that's so amazing, right? From a frictional standpoint, it's fantastic. From an operational standpoint, it actually excludes a lot of communities. And one of those communities, from a business standpoint, is going to be the cannabis industry. And because, the nuances of why are you going to have to work in all cash, there's not banking protections yet for cannabis businesses. And there are possibilities and opportunities for cannabis businesses to find banks and to bank with them. However, because of the federal backing, federal illegality, and banks are FDIC insured, it's much harder to find a bank for a cannabis business. And so what does that mean for an accountant? It means that you have to feel very comfortable dealing with all cash. And when I say dealing with all cash, the accounting is different. No, I'm not talking about the technical accounting. The procedure of making sure that you can actually get the transactions to the books and records and code them correctly is where it is an art and a science, right? You need to make sure that receipts and payments and invoices actually get to the accounting record so you can account for them, and then you can later use those receipts as evidence for deductions to the tax, right? To the IRS, right? So accounting is different. So working in all cash from a completeness standpoint of the books and records, that's one thing. But the second thing is that there is a huge risk of theft. So cash management, how do you actually manage cash in an operation if a business only deals with cash? So imagine that a company does more than $1 million in sales, right? Clearly they're not going to have $1 million in cash all at once because they've got their cost of goods sold, they've got their expenses, all of that. But they are going to have cash balances. They're going to need to pay vendors. They're going to need to pay employees. They're going to receive money from their customers, right? And so all of that cash, that movement of cash, it needs to be tracked very, very well, daily, continuously, right? So we make sure that our accounting records are up to date, but it also has to be managed, that there are proper controls in place to mitigate, to limit the risk of fraud, the risk of the misappropriation of assets, right? It's a very important thing to make sure that those businesses have, right? Beyond that, there are rules. There are state rules and there are federal rules of what, if a business is dealing all in cash, what they have to do to comply, right? So it's very important that as an accountant, you feel comfortable working in all cash. Number 4, dial in your inventory and your cost accounting. So if you've been working with service-based businesses, well, you might be in store for something, right? So a big asset that a cannabis business has is inventory, right? So when you think about it, how does the cannabis business make money? They sell cannabis, right? So inventory is massively important. And inventory is so important because inventory and cost of goods sold, when the inventory is sold, cost of goods sold is the only thing that can be deducted according to the IRS rule 280E. Now there's so many nuances there, right? And so, we'll get into the details of what that actually means and all of that later, but inventory is such an important asset. So from an accounting perspective, again, we have to make sure that we know what cost accounting is, right? Manufacturing overhead, that we can really understand the different types of businesses that operate in the cannabis supply chain and what is included in inventory for those businesses. We need to be able to account for that. We need to be able to understand and be able to create management reports so management can understand how inventory moves and, even their tax liability, right? So there's so many different nuances from the accounting perspective of inventory, right? So tax perspective, a cost perspective, a valuation perspective, a management decision perspective, right? So there's a lot that goes into inventory, right? Inventory management, just like cash management, is quite important. So inventory management, that goes from the initial order, right, of when you're purchasing inventory or making inventory. Let's say if you're making it in a manufacturing environment, to getting it all the way fulfilled to the customer, right? So managing that entire cycle, right? That's considered inventory management. So that's a lot of supply chain management, the ordering process, the counting inventory, the reconciling inventory, right? So there's a lot to get comfortable with when it comes to inventory in the business. It's not just that, oh, it's on the balance sheet, here's inventory. No, it is critical. And then the last point I mentioned was IRC 280E, right? So that is the tax code, federal tax code that I wrote the book on. Long story short, not much you can deduct besides the cost of goods. Cost of goods sold is related to inventory, right? So making sure, number 4, that you are very comfortable with your inventory, the accounting, the inventory management is critical. Number 5, advocacy. So cannabis in its essence, and this was one of the coolest things when I got into this space, is all about justice, right? It's all about speaking up. It's all about working with regulators, trying to convince regulators to legalize, at one point lobbying, right? And as an accountant, when you are working with businesses, right? If you are an employee working with that business, that's one thing, right? If you are a consultant working with those businesses, it's another. But you need to feel very comfortable with calling the IRS, calling the regulatory body that deals with cannabis taxes, right? And advocating on behalf of your client, because this is something that is going to happen quite often, right? I mean, not every day, but definitely a few times throughout the year, where you are going to want to have those key contacts that you know that you can call, that you can ask for advice, that you can get insight on, right? And you really want to feel comfortable with how do you advocate with regulators. From my experience, finding key contacts is really key to your success in kind of getting answers quickly, right? And then as you start asking questions and needing the guidance that is in the rules and regulations, make sure that everything is in writing, right? So getting it in writing is, we'll talk about in the next few points, it's evidence. It is evidence for how you made the decision, right? It's evidence of what they said at that one moment, because regulation is always changing, right? It's very important to make sure that you have, right? So advocacy with regulators is a very important thing as you get into the cannabis industry. Number 6, understand the power of SOPs, standard operating procedures. Well, first, it's a requirement for most cannabis businesses, right? That they need to submit as part of their application process, standard operating procedures. But where I've noticed it falls short in the industry, and even with some of the professionals that are working with the industry, is that standard operating procedures are great because they standardize operations. They teach people how to do things. They allow you to become more efficient, right? And so embrace and understand the power of SOPs. As an accountant, you don't need to know the SOP for the grow. You don't need to know the SOP for packaging, right? You need to know the SOPs and maybe even to, understand at least what the best practices are for invoicing, for paying vendors, for accounting inventory, for accounting cash, right? Those are SOPs that are very important for you as consultants, as accountants, as financial advisors to make sure that your clients have, or the businesses that you're working with have those standards in place, right? So embrace and understand the power of them because they're such a powerful tool when used correctly. And last but not least with the SOPs is that they improve the bottom line. If you can build out an SOP that helps mitigate fraud, that can help make a process more efficient, that can include policies to help billing, right? Like there's so many things where SOPs actually help improve the bottom line, which is very important as an accountant. Number 7, document everything. As a former auditor, as an accountant, I think it is imperative to write everything that I've done to make sure that if somebody were to review my work, whether an IRS agent, another consultant, the client, another accountant, somebody, in 5 years, that they would be able to understand why I did something. Now, in a industry that's changing a lot with regulation and tax even, right? And an industry that's federally illegal, it's important that if you are creating a calculation or that you are deciding to do something that, can impact financials or impact a business, that you document that process, right? Not only will it, be supporting evidence of, if there is an audit or some form of an investigation or something of that sort, but it helps formalize what you're doing and it shows what a methodology that you could be using is, or your reasoning behind getting to a certain calculation, right? So I don't mean document every client meeting. That is a good practice, right? But I mean, if you are deciding to do a tax calculation a certain way, if you are deciding to do an allocation a certain way, if you had a conversation with somebody, a regulatory body that said, this is actually how you're supposed to do it, right? Those are things that you want as supporting evidence to help substantiate why you did something. So it's important that you document everything of importance, right? So that to me is number 7 on what you've got to be doing as an accountant in the industry. Number 8, build your referral network. I think as accountants, we're pretty good at this, right? We know who we like to work with. We know that, business owners work a lot with lawyers. We know that building referrals helps us build business. But beyond that, I want you to think about it in another level. First and foremost, you cannot be a jack of all trades in the cannabis industry. It is such a big, it is such a vast, it is such a wide industry that you want to specialize and go deep instead of going so far and broad, right? You do not want to be an expert in security. You do not want to be an expert in a specific manufacturing or packaging. You want to stay in your lane as an accountant and figure out from there how you can kind of shift and move, right? So it's important that you build your referral network. You want to build your referral network so you can learn more about the industry, but you can make sure that you have the businesses that you're working with have the opportunity to really get to work with other skilled expertise, right? So it's very important just to build your referral network from those 2 standpoints. But the last and very important thing is that joining a referral network really helps you build your authority, right? If you are part of a referral network or a group of, even other accountants, let's say like at CVM, but If you are part of a networking group, you are showing up as maybe the only accountant that's doing cannabis, right? Or the only, accountant that specializes in this one certain thing. So building your referral network also helps you build your authority, which is great as you are trying to build your business and your career and improve. If we're constantly trying to evolve and improve, it's a no-win there. Number 9, last but certainly not least, one of the most important things is that you want to do due diligence. Now, due diligence, if you have worked with investors, is something that if you're thinking about buying a company, there's a whole form of due diligence that you want to do. But I mean, in terms of who you do business with, who you work with, applying professional skepticism onto everything. Cannabis is still such a new industry. It's important that you want to protect yourself and protect your clients, right? And so maintaining this level of professional skepticism is so important as you grow your niche, as you get into this industry or any industry for that matter, right? It is important that you assess your risks, the risks of doing business with a certain individual, the risk of doing business in the cannabis industry, right? It's important that you assess those risks and that you have this professional skepticism in everything that you do, right? I go to say even due diligence on everyone, right? And that is from an entrepreneurial standpoint, it's you want to love and you want to trust everybody, but it's important that you make sure that who you're working with, especially if you're taking on potential clients, that they're people and they're entities that are above board, that are compliant, that are how you like to do business, right? And so individually, you're going to have your own way of, assessing the due diligence on somebody. It could just be your own kind of process that you do in the evening after meeting somebody. It could be a review that you do with a team. That is going to be particular on the client, on the circumstance, on what the actual impact is. But it's really important to apply that framework because that framework is going to help you in so much that you do. Right? So that's number 9. That's due diligence. And so I think we covered a lot, right? We've got a few more slides and I wanted to give you kind of those actionable plans to make sure that you really feel comfortable with the transition, right? So I give you 9 things that you want to really focus on, right? To get in and build that, build that great transition plan into the cannabis industry, right? There's a lot. And so next, actionable steps, right? And so you first and foremost really want to understand what it is to be a cannabis accountant, right? A cannabis accountant is different than your traditional accountant. So you want to really make sure that you understand that and that you feel comfortable with the regulation process, right? Those first few points, it's all about rules and all about regulation. So you want to feel comfortable about how to access regulation, where to access it, what type of regulation as an accountant you really need to understand, right? You want to feel comfortable about that. You also want to feel quite comfortable about cash, right? Cash on hand, cash management. What kind of accounting do you really need to do? And what kind of tools do you really need to do with cash? You've got to feel comfortable with that when you decide to jump into the cannabis industry. You want to know what the IRS rules are regarding cash. You also want to know what the state rules are regarding cash. So you want to make sure that you feel great and confident about requirements from all the regulatory bodies as it relates to specific things that you're going to be dealing with in cannabis accounting. You really want to upskill your inventory, right? So you don't need to get, 6 months intensive course on inventory, but you need to minimum understand the basics of cost accounting, inventory management, what actually is included in inventory by the different cannabis businesses, right? Because those are even different. And that will allow you to then upskill your knowledge about IRC 280E, which is that tax code I was saying earlier that is all about what you cannot deduct, right? And you can't deduct anything besides your cost of goods sold, right? So it's really important that if you are thinking about getting into the cannabis industry, that you focus on these things next. And so I wanted to give you an offer. It's something that I've been working on for a few years, right? And I update it every year, but I created Cannabis Finance Bootcamp to take you through everything that you need to know to get started with your cannabis accounting and your cannabis compliance. So it's a video series with downloadable templates, downloadable checklists, and downloadable calendars that will help you as an accountant getting into the cannabis industry. It's going to teach you what you need to know about the rules and regulation. It's going to teach you about how to actually build standard operating procedures as it relates to the cannabis operations. It's going to talk to you about the different license types and how do you navigate those different license types. And it's going to dive deep into cash management, tools to track your cash expenditures and working with kind of all cash businesses and what you need to do to be compliant with the IRS cash regulations and any state regulations. It's also going to dive very deep into what is inventory and best practices. I worked with inventory so much as, a consultant, as an accountant, too much actually. So teaching you how to make sure that you have really good standard operating procedures in inventory management to help the cannabis business mitigate theft, increase efficiencies, and just be stellar. And then, of course, because it's one of the most important things that you need to master, we're going to have a huge section about IRC 280E. There's so many court cases. There's so many, court cases that have set precedent to what can and cannot be done when trying to navigate the tax code. And so you'll learn about that and, tips and tricks to make sure that you are prepared and have developed the best type of strategy for the cannabis business that you can. Right. And so as you can see over on the screen that I'm sharing, it is video series training. We've got 89 modules, but you'll be able to cover this course within a few days. Right. And so by those few days, you will have not only a deep understanding of the rules, regulation, cash management, inventory management, and IRC 280E, but you're going to feel very confident about how you can actually use those tools in a way to help a cannabis business, which is to me one of the most important things ever. I'd been doing this since 2015, worked with a lot of different clients. And so this is a culmination of my work with them. And then just realizing things can be better because with good accounting, businesses will continue to thrive, especially in this space. And, the last part of the offer that I have is that you can use the coupon code Cannabis Accountant to get a $49 discount. So the whole price of all this is just $199, right? And so if you think about the hours that I've put in, the hours that it would take you as an accountant to kind of go do all this research, develop the templates, develop the tools, this is an unbelievable price that you will have for your lifetime, right? So I update this course periodically. You'll have kind of any updates that relate to IRC 280E, cash account, cash, any of that kind of stuff. But you got this in your arsenal as a tool that you can use today, tomorrow, and in the future for any of your cannabis businesses. So all you have to do is you can head on over to CBM Network in the learning section and get to our courses, or you can go to a special link, URL Cannabis Business Minds, and you can kind of complete that checkout, right? And so it is so important as an accountant, if you are wanting to be part of the cannabis industry, to make sure that you've got your ducks in the row, that you feel confident and empowered about IRC 280E, about inventory management, about inventory costing, about working all in cash, and really feeling empowered and understand how you can make the regulation and the rules that are constantly changing part of your competitive advantage as an accountant. Wherever we see each other next, I hope it's inside the course, I want you to focus on one thing. You are an amazing accountant. You have a ton of knowledge, you have a ton of skills, and it is one of the best industries to be part of, the cannabis and the CBD industry and the hemp industry, right? And so if you are trying to make a change, if you are trying to really build something new and exciting for both your career and finding that fulfillment for you, but also for these other businesses, I invite you to be the change that you want to see and join the cannabis industry with me and so many other cannabis accountants. So thank you so much for listening to this webinar. I will see you on the other side.